The rain swept over Vienna like sheets of silver, drumming against cobblestones and soaking the streets as Clara Jensen clutched her worn leather bag tightly against her chest and stepped through the towering iron gates of the Harrington estate. She could hardly believe she was here at all, standing before the mansion of Alexander Harrington. The man spoken of with envy in social circles and with awe in business ones. The man known as the Ice King of Vienna. The long stone driveway stretched before her, lined with polished black cars glistening in the storm, leading to a house that rose like a palace. 3 stories of pale stone and glass, its windows spilling warm golden light into the rain. Her heart beat furiously, not from fear of the storm, but from the weight of the life she was about to step into. She hadn't come to admire riches, she had come to work. She was the new maid, and the pay was enough to support her mother back home, enough to repair the leaking roof of their crumbling farmhouse, enough to give her a chance at a new beginning. Inside, the air was colder still, not only from the hum of air conditioning, but from the atmosphere itself. White marble floors gleamed beneath a massive chandelier. Walls lined with paintings and glass displays spoke of generations of wealth. And silence pressed down heavily, broken only by the ticking of a distant clock. Behind a sleek glass desk sat a tall woman in a black skirt and crisp white blouse. Her beauty sharp and intimidating, her gaze making Clara instantly self-conscious of her simple brown dress. "You must be the new maid," she said with crisp authority. Clara nodded quickly. "I am Mrs. Dalton, the head housekeeper. Follow me. Mr. Harrington does not tolerate delays." Her heels clicked against marble as she led Clara through polished hallways, past portraits of powerful men, rows of awards, and shelves filled with books Clara could not even pronounce. Finally, they entered the kitchen, and Clara's breath caught. It was larger than the house she grew up in, filled with gleaming counters and appliances that looked untouched. "This is where you will work," Mrs. Dalton explained as she placed a slim file on the counter. "Mr. Harrington is very particular. His meals must be prepared exactly to his preferences. What he eats, when he eats, how it must be served. The details are here. And one more rule, you are never to enter his study. Do your job, stay invisible, and you will last here." With that, Mrs. Dalton checked her watch, her voice sharp as she said, "He will be home any moment. Make sure dinner is ready and hot." Then she vanished down the hall, her footsteps echoing against the marble. Clara inhaled deeply to steady herself. Cooking was something she knew well. She had learned by instinct over firewood stoves back home, not with measuring cups or fine recipes, but with heart. She unpacked the fresh vegetables and meat she had been given, moving quickly and carefully, and soon, the kitchen filled with the aroma of garlic, herbs, and sizzling spices. For the first time since entering this house, she felt a flicker of peace. But that peace shattered the moment the front door slammed. Heavy footsteps echoed through the mansion, strong and purposeful, drawing closer. Clara froze, her hand trembling above the spice rack. She did not need to be told who it was. The doorway darkened, and Alexander Harrington entered, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored suit, immaculate despite the storm outside. He carried himself with a force that filled the room before he even spoke. His sharp blue eyes swept the kitchen in a single glance before landing on her. His voice deep and commanding. "Who are you?" Clara quickly wiped her hands on her apron, her voice trembling but steady enough. "Good evening, sir. My name is Clara Jensen. I am the new maid." He did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked past her, lifted the lid of the pot she was preparing, and inhaled faintly. His expression barely changed as he asked, "You used fresh garlic?" "Yes, sir," she replied carefully, uncertain whether that was right or wrong. His brow tightened almost imperceptibly. "I do not take fresh garlic at night, it is too strong. Use powdered garlic next time." Clara's cheeks flushed. "I am sorry, sir." He cut her off coldly. "Do not be sorry, be correct." With that, he replaced the lid, turned, and walked out, his presence lingering in the air like the trace of his cologne. Clara exhaled, shakily, realizing she had been holding her breath. This was Alexander Harrington, the Ice King of Vienna. Brilliant and ruthless, a man who wore his coldness like armor. She had no intention of crossing him. Yet in that brief flicker of his eyes, before the mask hardened again, she wondered if there was something hidden beneath the ice, something the world was never meant to see. That the storm outside had softened to a drizzle, but inside the Harrington mansion, the silence felt heavier than ever. Clara was just finishing the evening meal when a sudden crash echoed through the corridor. Sharp and startling, breaking the stillness like shattered glass. Her heart raced as she set the spoon down and hurried toward the sound. Turning the corner, near the study, she froze. Alexander Harrington, the man they called the Ice King, was on the floor. His face was pale, his chest rising unevenly, his usually commanding frame weakened and fragile in a way that seemed almost impossible. Without thinking, Clara dropped to her knees beside him. "Sir, what happened?" she whispered, her hands trembling as she reached for him. His eyes opened faintly, meeting hers for just a second. And in that fleeting moment, she saw something raw and human flicker in them before his lids closed again. Panic surged through her, but instinct pushed her forward. She braced her arms around him, struggling to lift his weight, guiding him slowly against the wall and then into a chair near the study door. His body was heavy, but his strength had deserted him. She pressed her palm gently against his forehead. It was damp with sweat, his skin clammy, his breathing strained. "Breathe slowly. You'll be all right," she whispered urgently, though her own heart pounded wildly. She dashed into the kitchen, grabbed a cloth, dampened it with cold water, and returned to press it gently to his skin. Her fingers brushed against his jawline as she adjusted the cloth, and for the briefest moment she felt the sharp contrast between the man he was known to be and the fragile state he was in now. Alexander Harrington, feared, admired, untouchably looked, utterly human, vulnerable, and alone. Minutes dragged into hours as she cared for him, her small frame moving with quiet determination. She brewed ginger tea, brought water, and sat close, enough to watch his every breath. Each time his eyes fluttered open, she met his gaze with calm reassurance, even when fear tugged at her own chest. At one point, his voice, low and rough, broke the silence. "Why are you helping me?" His tone carried disbelief, as though no one had ever stayed by his side in weakness before. Clara swallowed, her voice soft but steady. "Because I must. I couldn't just leave you like this." He stared at her for a long moment, his icy blue eyes studying her face as though searching for deception. But he found none, only the quiet determination of a woman who refused to abandon him. "Most people," he rasped, his breath uneven, "would have run." Clara shook her head firmly. "I didn't think about that. I just couldn't." The mansion, usually so cold and distant, seemed to shift around them. The ticking clock in the hallway became the only sound, mingling with the soft patter of rain outside. In that fragile silence, something unseen formed between them, a thread of trust. Delicate yet undeniable. As the night stretched on, she adjusted his coat around him, dabbed the sweat from his brow, and made sure he drank every sip of the tea. Occasionally his gaze lingered on her, not with the usual icy scrutiny, but with something heavier, something unspoken. By the time dawn's light crept faintly through the tall windows, Alexander had regained some of his strength. He sat upright now, leaning against the arm of the chair, his breathing steadier though his voice remained low. "You stayed," he murmured, his eyes locked on hers. "You didn't have to, but you did." Clara lowered her gaze, her cheeks warming as she replied softly, "It's my duty to care for you. I didn't want to see you hurt." For a man who rarely showed anything but coldness, his next words carried a rare sincerity. "You are unlike anyone I've ever met." And in that moment, Clara realized the night had changed everything. The walls around his heart, walls the world believed unbreakable, had shifted ever so slightly in her presence. For Alexander, a man who trusted no one, her quiet determination had left a mark. And for Clara, who had stepped into this house expecting nothing more than work, her life had already begun to change in ways she never imagined. Morning broke over Vienna with a golden light that spilled across the Harrington estate. washing. The marble floors and tall windows in a glow that softened the cold edges of the mansion. Clara moved quietly through the kitchen, her body heavy with exhaustion from the long night she had spent by Alexander's side. Yet her spirit steady, determined to show no weakness. She prepared breakfast with meticulous care, chopping vegetables with precision, arranging bread and fruit neatly on the tray, and brewing coffee strong and fragrant. Her movements were calm, but inside her heart still replayed the images of the night before: Alexander, pale and fragile, Alexander breathing unevenly, Alexander looking at her not as a servant but as a lifeline. As she placed a steaming pot of tea on the stove, she sensed his presence before she even turned. The doorway darkened, and Alexander Harrington stood there, as imposing as ever in his tailored navy suit, though his tie was loosened and his posture held a faint weariness. He said nothing at first, only watched her. His piercing blue eyes, always so cold and unreadable, now carried a subtle weight she could feel pressing against her chest. Clara's hands hesitated for just a second before she continued her work. The sound of the knife against the cutting board, the only noise in the vast kitchen. "You made tea last night." His voice came at last, low and calm, each word deliberate. "Ginger, wasn't it?" Clara froze for half a second, surprised he had noticed, before nodding. "Yes, sir. I thought it might help." His gaze lingered on her as he stepped closer, hands tucked casually into his pockets, his presence filling the space. He studied the pot she had just placed on the stove, then inclined his head slightly. It was thoughtful. The words were simple, but from him they carried weight heavier than praise. Clara felt her cheeks warm as she answered softly, "Thank you, sir." She turned her focus back to the tray, but in the corner of her eye, she could see him still watching, his expression unreadable yet less cold than it had been the night before. The silence between them was no longer heavy, no longer oppressive. It had shifted into something quieter, something that felt almost like acknowledgement. From that morning on, their interactions began to change. They were small shifts, so subtle, they might have gone unnoticed to anyone else, but to Clara they were unmistakable. When she set meals on the table, he no longer glanced past her, but at her. When she adjusted his preferences in food or routine, he noticed, his sharp eyes catching every detail, and sometimes, when the air was still and the mansion silent, she caught him watching her not critically, not coldly, but with an expression she could not yet define. For Alexander Harrington, a man whose life had been built on walls of ice and iron, Clara Jensen's quiet diligence was beginning to pierce through. And for Clara, who had come to this house expecting only rules and distance, every glance, every unspoken acknowledgement carried a strange, unexplainable warmth. The barrier between master and maid was still firmly there, but somewhere in the silence of those mornings, a fragile bond had begun to take root. The days that followed fell into a delicate rhythm. Clara moved through the Harrington mansion with quiet grace, her steps soft against the marble floors, her hands busy with endless tasks, her presence steady and reliable. She adjusted Alexander's meals without being told, anticipated his preferences with uncanny instinct, and never once complained or faltered. And though he rarely spoke, Alexander noticed. He noticed the way she tucked her hair behind her ear while concentrating, the way her hands moved with precision, the way she never tried to draw attention, yet always left her mark in the smallest of details. One morning, as Clara prepared the breakfast tray, Alexander appeared in the doorway with a different air about him. His usual severity was tempered by something almost mischievous. Without warning, he stepped forward and, with swift ease, took hold of the tray just as she reached for it. Clara gasped in surprise, her eyes wide as he raised an eyebrow, the faintest trace of amusement touching his lips. "Surely, I can handle this myself," he remarked smoothly, though the spark in his eyes betrayed his intent. Before she could respond, he pivoted sharply and walked out of the kitchen, the tray balanced easily in his hands. Clara's shock gave way to indignation, and, without thinking, she hurried after him. "Mr. Harrington, please, you'll spill it," she exclaimed, but his pace quickened, his tall frame moving effortlessly down the hall. A laugh deep low, and startlingly warm escaped him as she chased after him. Her footsteps light and frantic against the polished floor. For the first time, the halls of the mansion echoed not with silence, but with laughter and motion. Clara darted around a corner, nearly stumbling as Alexander spun away from her grasp, holding the tray just out of reach. "You'll never catch me," he teased, his voice rich with humor, a tone she had never heard from him before. Her cheeks flushed with both exertion and disbelief. "Give it back," she demanded breathlessly, though a smile tugged at her lips despite her best efforts. Through the hallways, past the towering windows and down into the living room, they raced her. Laughter spilling freely now, his rare grin breaking the cold mask he always wore. Finally, she lunged forward, her fingers brushing against the edge of the tray, and with a swift tug, she pulled it from his grasp. Breathless and flushed, she held it triumphantly against her chest while he slowed to a stop, his eyes bright, his chest rising and falling with quiet laughter. "Very well," he conceded, his voice low but touched with amusement. "You are faster than I expected." Clara's smile lingered as she caught her breath, her heart beating not just from the chase but from the closeness, the rare warmth radiating from him. The air between them was charged, different, alive in a way she had never felt within these walls. Later that day, when she entered the library to tidy the shelves, Clara found something resting on the desk that made her heart still. A bouquet of sunflowers, her favorite bright and golden against the dark wood, with a small handwritten note beside it. "For the one who brings light into this house." Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, her chest tightening with emotion. She turned instinctively toward the doorway, and there he was, leaning casually against the frame. His usual stoic expression softened into something private and warm. "You didn't have to," she whispered, her voice catching slightly. His reply was quiet, sincere, and without hesitation. "I wanted to." In that moment, Clara realized the mansion no longer felt as cold as it once had. Between playful chases, rare laughter, and small gestures of kindness, Alexander Harrington's ice was beginning to crack. And in those cracks, something fragile and beautiful was beginning to grow. Evenings in the Harrington mansion had grown warmer with Clara's presence. What was once a silent palace of marble and glass now carried the hum of quiet laughter, the softness of small conversations, and the comfort of simple companionship. One evening, Clara sat curled against Alexander on the grand leather couch in the living room, the fire crackling softly in the corner, golden light flickering across his sharp features. For the first time, she allowed herself to relax fully. Leaning against his shoulder, her heartbeat steadying in the rhythm of his breathing, his arm rested loosely around her, protective and natural. A gesture that spoke of a closeness neither had expected, but both silently welcomed. Then the sound of laughter, bold and dramatic, sliced through the moment. Clara startled and sat up, straight, while Alexander's jaw tightened, though the faintest trace of amusement flickered at his lips. At the doorway stood Lady Margaret Harrington, his formidable aunt, dressed in a striking emerald gown, her eyes sparkling with mischief and disbelief. She placed her hands on her hips, her voice rich with theatrical delight. "Alexander Harrington, my nephew, sitting here cuddling with a woman. Tell me I am not dreaming." Clara's cheeks flushed crimson as she rose quickly, smoothing her uniform, her heart pounding in her chest. "Good evening," she said softly, her voice polite but trembling. "My name is Clara Jensen." Before she could finish, Alexander rose smoothly to his feet, placing a steady hand on her arm, halting her words. His voice came firm and unyielding. "Aunt Margaret, meet Clara, my girlfriend." The declaration hung in the air like a thunderclap. Lady Margaret's laughter filled the room, dramatic and booming, echoing against the marble walls. "Girlfriend. My Alexander finally has a girlfriend. This house will not survive such a revelation." She clutched her chest with exaggerated flair, her eyes dancing with amusement as she moved closer, circling Clara as though inspecting her like a rare jewel. Clara stood tall despite the heat in her cheeks, meeting the older woman's gaze with quiet dignity. "Well now, Lady Margaret said, her tone softening into something curious and oddly approving. So this is the young woman who has tamed the Ice King, the one who makes him smile. She arched a brow at Alexander, whose calm expression betrayed only the faintest upward curve of his lips. You've been hiding her from me, haven't you? Alexander slid an arm gently around Clara's shoulders, drawing her subtly closer. There was nothing to hide, he said evenly, though his eyes held a rare warmth as they lingered on Clara. I simply had no reason to announce what was mine until now. Lady Margaret's laughter rang out again, though this time with more joy than mockery. My word, Alexander, I have never seen you like this. And you, she added, turning back to Clara, you must have worked some kind of magic to make this man soften. I thought his heart was carved from stone, yet here he stands with you at his side. Clara's lips curved into a shy smile, her voice quiet but steady. I've done nothing extraordinary, ma'am. I simply care for him. Lady Margaret's eyes softened then, her theatrical air slipping into something far more genuine as she nodded. And perhaps that is exactly what he needed. The room, once filled only with cold silence, now brimmed with warmth, laughter, and the unmistakable shift of something greater. For Clara, it was the first time she felt recognized not as a maid, not as an employee, but as someone who mattered. To Alexander, and for Alexander, unshaken by his aunt's dramatics, his simple declaration had changed everything. No longer hidden in shadows, their bond now stood in the open, witnessed by family. Alive with new meaning. Later that night, the Harrington mansion glowed with the warmth of firelight. The echoes of Lady Margaret's laughter still lingering in the halls. Yet when the grand living room settled into quiet, her expression softened, the theatrics fading into something more reflective. She sat in her favorite armchair by the fire, her eyes fixed on Alexander as he leaned casually against the mantel, Clara seated nearby, her presence calm and steady. For a long moment, Lady Margaret said nothing, only studied her nephew with eyes filled with both pride and memory. I remember another night in this very room, she began, her voice lower now, stripped of drama. 6 years ago, you were not standing tall, then Alexander, you were broken. Clara lifted her gaze, startled by the sudden gravity in her tone. While Alexander's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly, though he did not interrupt. Lady Margaret continued, her voice carrying the weight of memory. The night you discovered your wife's betrayal. The night you learned the children you raised were not your own. I found you here, collapsed in that very chair, your face pale, your spirit shattered. You wept openly, something I had never seen you do before, and it broke me to watch. For weeks, you wandered these halls like a ghost, hiding behind anger, hiding behind silence. The world saw your mask of strength, but I saw the truth. I saw a man hollowed out by betrayal, building walls so high he swore no one would ever climb them again. The room grew still. Clara's chest tightened as she looked at him, her heart aching at the image of the man she had only known as unyielding strength. Alexander remained silent, his gaze fixed on the fire, the flickering flames dancing in his cold blue eyes. Lady Margaret shifted her gaze toward Clara, her voice trembling slightly. I feared you would never find your way back. I feared I would never again see you laugh, or smile, or look at another person with anything but ice. But now, she gestured softly toward Clara. Now I see you here, and for the first time in years, I see life in your eyes. Clara's breath caught as Alexander finally lifted his gaze, not at his aunt, but at her. His eyes, though still guarded, held a rare softness that spoke louder than words. Lady Margaret leaned back into her chair, her lips curving into a faint smile, her dramatic energy replaced with sincerity. She has given you back what you lost, Alexander. She has reminded you what it is to live, to feel, to care, and for that, I am grateful. Clara's cheeks flushed as she lowered her gaze. Humbled by the weight of the woman's words, Alexander's expression remained composed, but his hand moved almost instinctively. brushing gently against Clara's as if to silently affirm what his pride would not allow him to say aloud. Lady Margaret watched the gesture, her heart easing. At the sight, the Harrington mansion, once a fortress of silence and sorrow, now carried the quiet hum of healing. The broken man who had locked himself away behind steel and stone was slowly repenting. Not because of wealth, not because of power, but because of a woman who cared enough to see the man behind the mask. The days that followed carried a different energy inside the Harrington estate. The mansion, once so cold and silent, now seemed to hum with an unseen warmth. Alexander watched Clara more often than he admitted. Studying the quiet way she moved through the rooms, how she organized everything with care, how her presence softened the vast halls that had once felt like empty shells. She never tried to draw his attention, yet somehow, she always had it. One afternoon, Clara entered the library to dust the shelves and tidy the desk. The sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the dark wood, and there on the desk she found something that made her stop. A bouquet of bright yellow sunflowers, fresh and vibrant, stood in a simple glass vase. Resting against it was a folded note in Alexander's precise handwriting. For the one who brings light into this house. Her breath caught as she touched the petals gently, her fingers trembling as she lifted the note. She had never received such a gesture before, something so simple, yet so deliberate. Slowly, she turned toward the doorway, and there he was, leaning casually against the frame. His usual stern expression softened into something private, something meant only for her. "You didn't have to," she whispered, her voice catching, her cheeks warming with color. "I wanted to," he answered simply, his tone low, but sincere. His eyes steady on hers. The moment lingered, silent but full, and Clara felt her heart swell in a way she had not known was possible. It was not grand declarations or sweeping gestures, but quiet acknowledgement, a truth spoken without words. From that day on, their bond grew through the smallest of details. When she prepared tea, he would set it aside for her in the way she liked it. When she passed through the kitchen, he would brush by her shoulder just close enough to feel the spark of contact. When she smiled faintly while working, his gaze would linger, memorizing the curve of her lips. For Alexander, these gestures were uncharacteristic, yet natural with her, a language he could not deny. For Clara, each moment carried a warmth she could not explain, a steady reassurance that the walls between them were crumbling one by one. And as the days turned into weeks, the mansion itself seemed to transform, no longer a prison of marble and silence but a home where trust, laughter, and something tender had begun to bloom. Evening settled over the Harrington mansion with the glow of chandeliers casting golden light across polished marble floors. In the living room, the fire crackled softly, filling the space with a gentle warmth that matched the quiet intimacy between Alexander and Clara. They sat together on the grand leather couch, their conversation low, their laughter soft, their closeness effortless. Clara leaned against him, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, while his arm draped around her with a protectiveness that had become second nature. For a man who had spent years locking himself away from everyone, the gesture was almost startling. Yet in her presence it felt natural, easy, inevitable. The moment, tender and unguarded, was suddenly interrupted by the sharp sound of laughter ringing through the room. Clara startled, sitting upright, her cheeks flushing as Alexander's jaw tightened, though the faintest trace of amusement flickered in his eyes. At the doorway stood Lady Margaret, dressed in a flowing gown of deep violet silk, her presence as commanding as the grand room itself. Her hands rested firmly on her hips, her expression a mixture of shock and delight as her eyes widened. "Alexander Harrington," she exclaimed with theatrical disbelief, "seated here, relaxed, with a woman at your side. Tell me I am not imagining this." Clara's heart pounded as she rose quickly, her hands smoothing the folds of her plain dress, her voice quiet yet steady as she tried to speak. "Good evening, ma'am. My name is Clara Jensen. I am," she hesitated, unsure how to finish, but before she could, Alexander stood with quiet authority, his hand slipping gently to her arm, silencing her uncertainty. His voice was firm, calm, and filled with a weight that could not be mistaken. "Aunt Margaret, this is Clara, my girlfriend." The words landed like thunder in the vast room. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening as Lady Margaret threw back her head in laughter that boomed across the hall, her voice full of mock shock. "Girlfriend, my Alexander, the one who swore never to let anyone close again, finally has a girlfriend. This house will not survive such news." She clutched her chest with theatrical flair, circling Clara slowly as though examining a priceless gem. Clara stood still, her cheeks burning but her gaze steady, refusing to cower beneath the older woman's sharp eyes. Lady Margaret's tone shifted, her dramatic amusement softening into something more thoughtful. She studied Clara closely before turning back to her nephew. "So this is the young woman who has managed the impossible, who has warmed the heart I thought was carved from stone. You've been hiding her from me, Alexander, haven't you?" Alexander's lips curved almost imperceptibly, a rare smile reserved for moments few would ever witness. His arm moved around Clara's shoulders with deliberate certainty as he answered, his voice smooth, his tone final. "I wasn't hiding her, I was protecting what mattered." Lady Margaret's laughter bubbled again, though this time with genuine joy rather than mockery. "Ah, my dear nephew, how you surprise me. And you, Clara Jensen, you must be extraordinary indeed to make him claim you so openly. I never thought I would see this day." Clara's eyes softened, her voice quiet but steady as she replied, "I've done nothing extraordinary, ma'am. I only care for him." Lady Margaret's expression melted further, the theatrics fading into tenderness as she nodded. "And perhaps that is what makes you extraordinary." The fire crackled, the air filled with a new warmth, and the Harrington mansion, once a fortress of silence, now held the undeniable truth. Alexander Harrington had spoken aloud what he had never admitted to anyone. Clara was his, not as a servant, not as someone passing through his life, but as the woman who mattered. The laughter in the Harrington mansion slowly faded into quiet as the night deepened, the fire crackling softly in the grand living room, casting golden light across the polished walls. Lady Margaret sat back in her armchair, her dramatic air softening into something far more tender as her sharp eyes moved from her nephew to the young woman at his side. For years she had known Alexander as the Ice King, a man who carried power with ease but wore pain in silence. And as she studied the way Clara sat close to him, calm and steady, she felt something shift inside her heart. "I remember the man. You were 6 years ago," she began, her voice low, her tone stripped of theatrics. "I remember finding you broken in this very house, your eyes hollow, your spirit shattered. You had discovered that your wife had betrayed you, that the children you believed to be yours never truly were, and it destroyed you. I watched you crumble beneath the weight of betrayal, watched you hide your grief behind walls of anger and distance. You swore never to let anyone near you again. You laughed less, you trusted no one, and the house grew as cold as your heart." Clara listened, her own chest tightening at the rawness in Lady Margaret's words, her gaze drifting toward Alexander, who stood tall by the fire, his blue eyes fixed on the flames, his jaw set in quiet tension. She could see the shadows in his expression, could almost feel the scars of those years pressing against him even now. Lady Margaret's voice softened further, trembling with emotion. "For years, I feared you would never return to us. I feared I would never see your smile again, never hear your laughter, never witness you look at another person with anything but ice. But now," she gestured toward Clara, her eyes glistening, "now I see you alive again. I see warmth in your eyes when you look at her. I see the man you were meant to be, not the broken soul you became." The room grew still, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Clara's breath trembled as she lowered her gaze, humbled by the sincerity, her heart full at the thought that she had been able to bring even a fraction of light back into Alexander's life. Slowly, Lady Margaret rose from her chair, her dramatic presence replaced by something deeply maternal, and she placed a hand gently on Clara's shoulder. Her voice was soft but firm. "You have done what none of us could. You have given him back his laughter, his life, his heart. For that, my dear, you have my blessing." Clara's eyes shimmered as she met the older woman's gaze, and in that moment, she felt truly seen, not as a maid, not as someone beneath their world of wealth, but as a woman who mattered, as someone who belonged. Alexander finally turned from the fire, his gaze settling on Clara with an intensity that made her heart race. Without hesitation, he reached for her hand, his touch firm, grounding. And in his eyes, she saw something she had never seen so clearly before: gratitude, trust, and a quiet affection that defied every wall he had built. The Harrington mansion, once a place haunted by silence and sorrow, was no longer a tomb for broken memories. That night, under the watchful eyes of family, it became a home again, alive with warmth, with healing, and with the fragile but undeniable truth of love rediscovered. The morning sun rose over Vienna, spilling golden light across the Harrington estate. The mansion, once cold and unwelcoming, had been transformed into a place alive with warmth and color. Fresh flowers decorated the grand hall, their fragrance mingling with the sound of soft laughter and quiet conversation as family, close friends, and trusted staff gathered together. It was not a grand ball, nor a lavish affair, but something far more meaningful, a celebration of life and love within the walls that had once held only silence. Clara Jensen stood near the staircase, her hands clasped in front of her, her heart racing as she looked out at the faces gathered. She wore a simple cream dress, elegant yet modest, her hair pulled back neatly, her eyes shining with nervous anticipation. Never in her life had she imagined standing here in this way, not as a servant, not as an outsider, but as someone who truly belonged. Across the hall, Alexander Harrington stood tall and confident in a navy suit, his posture composed yet his eyes softer than anyone present had ever seen. The room fell silent as he stepped forward, his gaze fixed only on Clara. Taking her hand gently into his, he turned to face the crowd, his voice steady and strong, but laced with emotion. "For years, I lived behind walls of stone. I believed trust was dangerous, that love was impossible, and that my heart would never heal. But Clara," his eyes lingered on her, and the world seemed to fall away. "Clara brought life back into this house. She brought warmth into my days, laughter into my nights, and light into the darkest corners of my soul. She is not just the maid of this mansion. She is the woman I love, the woman I choose, and the woman I ask to stand beside me from this day forward." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the hall, followed by warm applause as smiles spread across every face. Lady Margaret clapped her hands together with tears sparkling in her eyes, her dramatic voice rising above the rest. "Finally, my Alexander, at last you have opened your heart, and to a woman who is worthy of you." Her words carried both pride and joy, filling the room with even greater warmth. Clara's throat tightened, her eyes shimmering as she turned to him, her voice soft but strong, clear enough for all to hear. "Alexander, I never expected this. I never imagined stepping into your world, but you gave me a place here. You gave me laughter, you gave me trust, and you gave me love. And I choose you, with all my heart, for today, for tomorrow, for the life we will build together." The room erupted in cheers, laughter, and celebration. Friends embraced, staff exchanged proud smiles, and Lady Margaret stepped forward to wrap both Alexander and Clara in her arms, whispering through tears, "You have my blessing, and may your hearts remain open, true, and filled with joy." As the celebration carried on, Alexander twirled Clara lightly in his arms, her laughter echoing through the hall like music. They spun in a playful dance, a mirror of the morning chases through marble corridors, but now not hidden in secrecy, instead witnessed and celebrated by those who mattered most. The mansion glowed brighter than ever before, filled with flowers, music, and the joy of love rediscovered. Later, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in amber and rose, Alexander and Clara stood together on the balcony overlooking the sprawling gardens below. Hand in hand, hearts steady, they looked out at the horizon, the laughter from inside still echoing faintly behind them. Alexander leaned close, brushing his lips softly against her temple, his voice low but sure. "We did it, Clara," she smiled, resting her head against his chest, her voice warm with certainty. "Yes, Alexander, we did together, beneath the fading light of evening, with family's blessing and the world behind them." The Ice King and the maid who had melted his heart stood as equals, bound by love, trust, and the promise of a future, unafraid, unbroken, and unshakable. The mansion that had once been frozen in sorrow now pulsed with life, and for the first time in years, Alexander Harrington's heart beat freely, completely, and wholly in love.